Welcome back. The next item of business is topical questions. Question number 1, Rob Gibson.
I have the following question to ask the Scottish Government what information it has on the cause of the electricity power cut which affected people in the north of Scotland on the 17th of April 2014.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, Scottish and Southern Electric Power Distribution discovered a faulty electronic relay at their Knocknagill grid substation near Inverness. It is believed the relay malfunctioned just before the outage last Wednesday, and circuit breakers identified a potential fault on the main network. These circuit breakers opened to protect the system supplying the north and west of the country from more protracted and significant damage. SSEPD have reviewed the events, modified systems and are confident this will prevent a recurrence of the same problem affecting their wider network in the future. I will place in Spice a more detailed account of the actions of the Scottish Government and supporting authorities during the loss of power on the 16th of April 2014.
Gibson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that explanation, which is the first that we've had in any detail, and I look forward to reading that in Spice. But can the Cabinet Secretary arrange for Scottish and Southern Energy to brief MSPs in affected areas on the grid control system for the north of Scotland to reassure our constituents that the system is resilient and ready to serve today's essential electronic systems?
Cabinet Secretary.
I certainly will be happy to convey that point to Scottish and Southern Energy. And I think it's certainly in my own dealings with the company in my own constituency. I've always found the company certainly very willing and able to provide substantial information about these issues and to provide that reassurance. On the wider question about the capability and the effectiveness of the grid system, quite clearly we are seeing a major enhancement of that grid capability with, for example, the development of the new Beauly to Denny power line, which is currently under development. That is a substantial investment in ensuring that we have grid capability and capacity that will prove resilient for many years. And the existing grid network is obviously carrying very heavy loads, given the increased generating capacity in the north and the west of Scotland. And obviously the installation of the new grids such as Beauly Denny will be a significant factor in ensuring that resilience in the years to come.
Rob Gibson.
Thank you for that detailed answer as well, because the grid system is very important to us in the north, as everywhere. But after a widespread power outage, what steps are taken by Scottish and Southern Energy to ensure that customers such as mobile phone services are able to reboot quickly? As the Cabinet Secretary is well aware from his visit to Ullapool on the 18th of April, no mobile phone signals were available in that area well into the afternoon following the outage, and there are many other systems that were affected. Can we find ways, in fact, to clarify this for MSPs in our area?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Gibson makes an important point that clearly the ability to re-establish power networks in the event of an outage is a high priority for Scottish and Southern Energy Power Distribution. The incident took place at 2036. All connections were essentially back up and running by 1 o'clock the following morning. Most had been reconnected by 11:30. But there was some further problems in the Orkney area which had a prolonged outage until about 1 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, there would be further implications for other networks. The mobile phone network that Mr Gibson refers to was one that was affected, and close working between the grid operators and individual suppliers is a priority. The First Minister convened a number of telephone conversations with resilience officials in the Scottish Government, both on Wednesday evening and in the course of Thursday, to make sure that all connectivity activity was taking place. And very swift action was undertaken on the Wednesday evening to ensure these connections were re-established. But obviously there are implications for other users that have to have just as prompt attention to make sure that other services are put into place where they have been disrupted by power outages.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The mass power outage affecting 200,000 homes across the Highlands and Islands last week was unusual and troubling. I'm concerned about the possible effects this will have on business and for elderly and vulnerable individuals within my region. Has the Cabinet Secretary or any of his colleagues received comprehensive statistics from the police, fire and rescue service and health boards to determine whether there was increased domestic and workplace accidents during the period that the power was off?
I have no information of that type, but what I can assure Mr Stewart about is that as part of the calls that were convened by the First Minister, all relevant emergency agencies were involved in those calls, and the priority of all of these discussions is essentially twofold. One is to press to ensure that services and supplies are restored at the earliest possible opportunity, and secondly, to identify any areas of vulnerability that may be experienced by members of the public. And health boards, the police authority are all involved in those calls to make sure that anybody, and local authorities, I should add, are involved to ensure that any possible vulnerability is identified, and the authorities are obviously aware of where such circumstances may be more likely to occur than in others. And of course, in some parts of the Highlands and Islands that were affected, standby generating capacity was able to be operated quite swiftly to ensure that services were applied as quickly as was possible in these circumstances.
Alex Johnson.
The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that some individuals with engineering experience have suggested that over-reliance on wind turbines may have contributed to grid instability. In raising this, could I ask that the Minister doesn't move straight to denial on this subject and actually takes the opportunity to inquire as to whether this could have been a contributing factor?
Well, I'm absolutely certain it's not a contributing factor, and I've given to Parliament, and this is, well, Mr Johnson's free to ask whatever questions he wishes, of course, but I would have thought that what I said to Parliament in my original answer would have been enough reassurance for Mr Johnson that Scottish and Southern Electric Power Distribution discovered a faulty electronic relay at their Knocknagale grid station near Inverness. Now, that is an explanation of what originated the problem and what had to be addressed by it. I can emphatically say to Mr Johnson, engineering experience or no engineering experience, that the comments we've had about the involvement of wind turbines are utterly misplaced in the analysis of this incident.
Liam MacArthur.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for outlining the detail what lay behind the problems and indeed for his response to Alex Johnson. He is right to say that there was more protracted delays in restoring power in my own constituency in Orkney. In providing the reassurance to Parliament that there should be no recurrence of this, have there been specific steps in relation to Orkney to ensure that that doesn't happen?
Secretary.
I think that I'm quite sure that Mr MacArthur will appreciate that the issue that affected the reconnection in Orkney was essentially a subsequent issue to the original fault in the engine in the switching system, which prolonged the issue by about 90 minutes, which obviously adds to the inconvenience for members of the public in the Orkney community. Scottish and Southern have looked very carefully over the Easter weekend at the circumstances that led to this particular incident, and obviously they are alert to the necessity to tackle any power outages and to minimise any inconvenience to members of the public, and that will remain their priority in moving forward. So I think the points that Mr MacArthur raises are important in relation to his constituents, and I can assure him that these factors will be looked at closely in identifying what steps can be taken to strengthen the existing arrangements to minimise these difficulties. Having visited the Scottish and Southern Grid Control Centre in Perth just after the Christmas break, actually, I saw at first hand the depth of the information and sophistication of the systems that are available to identify where outages are taking place around the country, and the efforts to try to tackle them are clearly a priority for Scottish and Southern Energy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that SSE and indeed social work have lists of vulnerable people that may be affected by power outages. Can I ask if that information is shared and checks are carried out on those people during such occurrences?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's really the point that I was making to Mr Stewart in my earlier answer, that when the resilience operation kicks in and the First Minister instructed the resilience operation to take place on that Wednesday evening, that immediately gives rise to, well, actually, there would be activity by local authorities and other agencies in advance of the activation of the resilience arrangements, just out of routine practice, to make sure that exactly the circumstances that Rhoda Grant has highlighted of vulnerable individuals. For example, we had information on a member of the public who required access to oxygen services in their own home, and of course with a power outage that makes that difficult, so the emergency services were able to give the particular support that was required by that individual in those circumstances. So the information about vulnerable individuals is held by local authorities and by emergency services. Whenever such a circumstance arises, those plans which are regularly exercised, all kick into action. And the type of resilience monitoring arrangements that the Government then puts in place are to provide reassurance that all necessary steps are being taken to ensure that any vulnerable individuals are being supported, as I explained to Mr Stewart, and that all steps have been taken to reactivate services where that requires to be undertaken.
Thank you. That ends topical question time. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 9773 in the name of the First Minister on the appointment of Scottish Ministers. Members who wish to speak in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And can I remind members that the question on this motion will be put immediately after the debate and not at decision time. I call on the First Minister to speak and move the motion. First Minister.